The station called Vaethar Prime was old, older than most civilizations that used it. It was a massive ring of metal and glass that floated in the slow light of a dying star, and it served one purpose: to give the galaxy a place to talk instead of fight. Inside the Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly, 312 species held seats. Some were tall and thin like glass sculptures. Some were heavy and scaled, with voices that shook the floor. Some floated in liquid tanks, their words translated through machines bolted to the outside. Some were clouds of light that pulsed in patterns no human could fully understand. Together, they formed the most powerful governing body in known space, and they had been governing for over 11,000 years before Earth even learned to split an atom. Today, a new seat had been added. It was small, placed at the far edge of the lowest tier. No banners hung behind it. No entourage of guards or advisors surrounded it. There was just a single man sitting in it, wearing a dark suit that looked painfully plain next to the ceremonial armor and bioluminescent robes of the delegates around him. His name was Elias Voss. He was 53 years old. He had gray at his temples and calm, tired eyes that moved slowly across the room like a man reading a book only he could see. Before this assignment, he had spent 20 years investigating war crimes on Earth, reading the faces of men who had done terrible things and swore they had not. He had been chosen for this post not because he was a scientist or a general, but because someone at the United Nations had said, "Send the man who knows when people are lying." The session had begun an hour ago. The topic was something called the redistribution of the Athkari Corridor, a network of faster-than-light travel lanes that connected 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. Whoever controlled the corridor controlled trade, movement, and power across a quarter of known space. It was, by any measure, the most important piece of real estate in the galaxy. Valith Concordant spoke first. They were insectoids, tall, elegant creatures with iridescent wings folded against their backs and compound eyes that glittered like wet gemstones. Their speaker, a female named Salithka, stood at the central platform and addressed the assembly with a voice like silk pulled over steel. She spoke of fairness. She spoke of shared prosperity. She said the corridor had been mismanaged for centuries and that a new agreement was needed, one that would benefit all species equally. Elias watched her. He did not listen to the translation device in his ear. He watched her hands. He watched the way her wings shifted, a faint tremor on the left side every time she said the word equal. He watched her eyes, how they tracked not the general audience but 3 specific delegations in the upper tiers. He noticed the way her antennae tilted forward when she spoke of open access and pulled back when she mentioned security provisions. He wrote something in a small notebook. The Drenari hegemony spoke next. They were reptilians, broad, muscular, covered in dark green scales that looked like plates of armor grown from their own bodies. Their representative, a male called Vorath Khan, spoke with blunt confidence. He supported the Valith proposal. He called it long overdue. He said the hegemony wanted nothing more than stability. Elias watched him too. He noticed that Vorath Khan never once looked at Salithka while speaking. Not once. In a room where alliances were performed like theater, that absence was louder than any words. He also noticed that Vorath Khan's jaw tightened every time he said stability, and that his claws, retracted, polite, scraped lightly against the podium when he spoke of the junction points along the corridor. Elias wrote something else in his notebook. Other delegates spoke. The Ulari, soft-bodied aquatic beings who floated in sealed travel spheres, gave a cautious statement of concern. The Fenkai, a nomadic species who lived aboard vast fleets and depended on open travel lanes, spoke with quiet desperation that no one seemed to hear. The Teshari, small, bird-like creatures who had only recently been uplifted to spacefaring status, voted in support of the Valith without saying a single word of their own. Elias watched all of them. He watched the Ulari delegate's color shift from calm blue to anxious violet when the Drenari representative glanced in their direction. He watched the Fengkai ambassador's hands grip the edge of her podium so hard that her knuckles went pale. He watched the Teshari delegate read from a prepared statement, and he noticed the slight hesitation before each sentence, the pause of someone speaking words that were not their own. He said nothing. He did not raise his hand. He did not ask questions. He did not even adjust his posture. For the entire 6-hour session, Elias Voss sat in his small seat at the edge of the lowest tier and simply watched, and the delegates of 312 species looked at him the way they might look at a stone placed among jewels present, but irrelevant. The session ended. Delegates filed out in clusters, their conversations resuming in encrypted channels and private wavelengths. The hall emptied slowly, like water draining from a basin. Elias stayed seated until almost everyone was gone. Then he closed his notebook, stood up, and walked back to the small suite of rooms that had been assigned to Earth's delegation. His staff was waiting, 4 people in total. Lieutenant Priya Menon, his security officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. Dr. James Okoro, a linguist who had spent 10 years learning alien communication patterns. Analyst Sarah Chen, who handled data and political mapping, and Corporal David Hale, who handled everything else. They looked at him as he entered. Priya spoke first. "How was it?" Elias set his notebook on the table. He looked at each of them, his own small, under-equipped, underfunded team standing in a borrowed room on a station older than their entire civilization. He thought about what he had just spent 6 hours observing. He thought about the silk in Salith Ka's voice and the steel underneath it. He thought about Vorath Khan's retracted claws and the Teshari delegates' borrowed words. "Every word spoken today was a lie," he said quietly. "Not a single delegate in that room said what they actually wanted." Priya raised an eyebrow. "Every delegate, all 312. "All of them." James leaned forward. "How can you be sure?" Elias sat down and opened his notebook. The pages were filled with small, careful handwriting, observations, sketches of body positions, arrows connecting names to behaviors to timestamps. It looked like the work of a man solving a murder, not attending a diplomatic session. "Because I have spent my entire life sitting across from people who are hiding something," Elias said. "Warlords, traffickers, politicians, men who smiled while they ordered executions. I learned their language, not the words, but the other language, the one spoken by hands and eyes and the muscles around the mouth, the one that every human learns to read before they learn to walk." He looked up at his team. "Every species in that room has spent thousands of years learning to deceive other species. But none of them evolved the way we did. None of them spent 100,000 years lying to each other, every single day, in every conversation, in every relationship, in every war and every peace." He paused. "We are the galaxy's oldest and best liars, and that means we are also the only ones who can hear the lies." The room was quiet. Sarah spoke softly. "So what do we do?" Elias closed his notebook and looked out the small viewport at the dim orange glow of the dying star beyond the station's hull. "We listen," he said, "and then we decide what to do with what we hear." Over the next 7 days, Elias did something no new delegate had ever done before. He asked for private meetings, not with the powerful, but with the weak. The request itself confused the Assembly's administrative staff. Newly admitted species were expected to spend their first cycle courting favor with the ruling coalitions, offering trade agreements and military access in exchange for protection. That was how the game was played. You bowed to the strong, and the strong allowed you to exist. Humanity had been in the galaxy for 18 months. By every measure, they should have been desperate for allies among the powerful. Instead, Elias asked to meet with the Ulari. The meeting took place in a humidity-controlled chamber near the station's aquatic quarter. The Ulari delegate, a being named Taluves, floated inside a sphere of warm, mineral-rich water. Taluves was nervous. Their skin shifted between shades of pale blue and anxious violet as Elias entered the room, and their tentacles curled inward, a defensive posture that Elias recognized immediately. They were afraid. Elias sat down across from the sphere. He did not bring a translator team or a protocol officer, just himself and his notebook. "Thank you for meeting with me," he said. Taluves pulsed a polite shade of green. "We are honored by the attention of the human delegation, though we confess we do not understand why you wish to speak with us. We are a minor trade species. We hold little influence." Elias nodded. "You hold 7 trade routes through the southern portion of the Athkari corridor, routes that the Valith proposal would reclassify as restricted military lanes." Taluves went very still. Their color drained to a near-transparent white. That information was not in the public version of the proposal. It was buried in a subclause of a subclause, written in legal language so dense that most delegations had not bothered to read it. "You read the full proposal?" Taluves asked. "I did, and I noticed something else." Elias leaned forward slightly. "During the assembly session, when the Drenari representative looked in your direction, your color shifted to violet. That is a fear response in your species. But it was not the Drenari you were afraid of. It was what you had already agreed to give them." The silence in the room was absolute. Taluves stared at him through the curved wall of their sphere. Then, slowly, their color shifted to a deep, exhausted gray, the Ulari shade of surrender. "They offered us protection," Taluves said quietly. "The Drenari, 6 cycles ago. They said if we provided them with information about Valith fleet movements along the corridor, they would ensure our trade routes survived the redistribution." "And you agreed?" "We had no choice. Without those routes, our economy collapses within a generation. We are a water world species. We cannot farm, we cannot mine. We trade or we die." Elias wrote nothing in his notebook. He simply looked at Taluves with an expression that the Ulari had never seen directed at them before, not pity, not judgment, but understanding. "You were afraid to refuse and afraid to agree," Elias said. "And now you are afraid that both sides will destroy you when they no longer need you." Taluves turned a shade of gray so dark it was almost black. "How can you know this? You have been in the galaxy for less than 2 of our cycles. How can you see these things?" Elias almost smiled. "Because where I come from, this is what every Tuesday looks like." The next meeting was with the Fenkai. Their ambassador, a woman named Kessarin, met Elias in a docking bay where her people's shuttle was parked. The Fenkai were nomads, lean, weathered, with skin like tanned leather and eyes that never stopped moving. They lived aboard great fleets that traveled endlessly between star systems, and they had no homeworld. The open hyperlanes of the corridor were not just trade routes for them. They were roads, and if those roads closed, the Fenkai would be trapped. Kessarin did not bother with diplomacy. She was too tired for it. "You are the human," she said. "I am." "Why are you here?" "Because during the assembly session, you gripped the edge of your podium hard enough to leave marks. Because your voice was steady but your breathing was not. Because you spoke for 3 minutes about open access and no one in the room reacted, which means they had already decided to ignore you before you opened your mouth." Kessarin stared at him. Then she sat down on the deck of her shuttle and put her head in her hands. 12,000 years, she said. "The Fenkai have attended the assembly for 12,000 years, and in all that time, not one delegate from any other species has ever looked at us closely enough to notice that we were suffering." "I noticed," Elias said. "Why?" He sat down across from her on the cold metal deck. "Because on my world, we have a saying, the loudest voice in the room is usually not the one in the most pain. The one in the most pain is the one no one is listening to." Kessarin looked at him for a long time. Then she told him everything: the backroom pressures, the threats disguised as offers, the slow strangulation of the Fenkai migration routes over the past century. She told him that 3 of her fleet's children had died last year because a maintenance closure on a key hyperlane had forced them into a radiation belt. She told him the closure had been engineered by the Valeth to pressure the Fengkai into accepting a labor contract. Elias listened. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes. He simply sat with her on the deck of her shuttle in that cold docking bay and listened until she was done. The third meeting was with the Teshari. They were small, barely reaching Elias' waist, with feathered crests and large, dark eyes that blinked too often. Their delegate, a young male named Pikren, met Elias in a borrowed conference room that was far too large for both of them. He sat in an oversized chair with his feet dangling above the floor, and he looked like a child called to the principal's office. "I know why you are here," Pikren said before Elias could speak. "Tell me." "You are here because during the assembly session, I read from a prepared statement, and you noticed that the statement was not mine." Elias nodded. Pikren's feathers flattened against his head, a sign of deep shame. "The Drenari wrote it. They have written all of our statements since we were granted our seat. They sponsored our uplift. They funded our education programs. They built our first orbital station. And in return, we vote as they tell us to vote. Every time. Every time. And if you refused." Pikren's large eyes blinked rapidly. "They would call in our debts. Our species has been spacefaring for only 90 years. We owe the Drenari more than we could repay in 1,000. If they demanded payment, we would lose everything, our station, our ships, our place in the assembly. We would be reduced to a per-contact species again." He paused. "Some of my people say that would be better than this." Elias leaned back in his chair. "The statement you read, what did it say exactly?" "It said we supported the Valeth redistribution proposal." "And what do the Teshari actually want?" Pikren looked at him with those large, dark eyes, and for a moment the mask of diplomatic composure cracked completely. What was underneath was not fear or anger. It was hope, raw, desperate, and barely alive. "We want to speak for ourselves," Pikren said. "Just once, we want to say our own words in that chamber." Elias closed his notebook. He had not written a single thing during any of the 3 meetings. He did not need to. Every word, every gesture, every shift in color and feather and breath was stored in the place where humans kept such things, in the part of the brain that had spent 100,000 years learning to read the truth behind the performance. That night, as the station's artificial lights dimmed to simulate evening, Salithka received a report from her intelligence network. The minor delegations were behaving strangely. The Ulari had canceled a scheduled meeting with the Drenari trade attaché. The Fengkai ambassador had been seen walking the corridors with an unusual calm. The Teshari delegate had requested, for the first time, an independent legal review of his species' debt agreements. All of these changes had started after contact with the human. Salithka summoned a private envoy, a skilled negotiator from her own staff, and sent them to Elias' quarters with an offer. The message was simple. Earth would receive exclusive access to 3 Valeth trade hubs, worth more than humanity's entire current interstellar economy. In exchange, Elias would stop talking to the minor delegations and sit quietly in his small seat for the remainder of the session. The envoy delivered the offer with practiced grace. Elias listened. Then he tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he is hearing something interesting but not surprising. "That is a generous offer," he said, "but it is also the 3rd best offer you are authorized to make. I can tell because your wing movement slowed when you reached the trade hub numbers. You were reciting a rehearsed figure, not the real one. And your antennae shifted left twice during the delivery, which, in Valeth body language, indicates that you are presenting an option you consider expendable." He paused. "So why don't you tell me the real offer? The one Salithka actually sent you here to make if the first one failed." The envoy stood frozen. Their wings trembled. Their compound eyes reflected the dim light of the room like shattered mirrors. They left without another word. Elias sat alone in the quiet of his borrowed room. He looked at the closed door for a long time. Then he picked up his notebook and wrote a single line. "They are starting to be afraid of us. Good." The emergency session was called on the 9th day. Salith Ka had demanded it. She stood at the central platform with her wings fully extended, a veileth display of authority that had silenced rooms for thousands of years, and announced that the assembly had been compromised by outside interference. She did not name Elias directly. She did not need to. Every delegate in the chamber knew who she meant. The hall was full. Every seat was occupied. Even the observation galleries above were packed with aides, translators, and intelligence officers from dozens of species. The air felt tight with tension, the kind that presses against the skin and makes it hard to breathe. Elias sat in his small seat at the edge of the lowest tier. His notebook was closed on his lap. Priya stood behind him, her eyes scanning the room with the careful focus of a woman who expected trouble. James, Sarah, and David were in the observation gallery above, watching everything. Salith Ka spoke for 20 minutes. She talked about the sacred traditions of assembly diplomacy. She talked about the trust that held the galaxy together. She talked about the danger of species that seek to disrupt rather than contribute. Her voice was beautiful, each word placed with the precision of a jewel set into a crown. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. When she finished, she turned to Elias. "The human delegation has been granted provisional membership. We propose that this provision be reviewed in light of recent conduct." A murmur ran through the chamber. This was not a small thing. Reviewing a membership was one step away from expulsion, and expulsion from the assembly meant isolation, no trade agreements, no travel rights, no protection under galactic law. For a species as young and weak as humanity, it would be a death sentence. Elias stood. The murmur died. 312 delegations watched the plain-suited human rise from his small seat and walk to the central platform. He carried no data pad, no prepared statement, no holographic display, just himself and his closed notebook. He looked out at the assembly, he took a slow breath, and then he began. "I'm not going to argue about the Athkari corridor today," he said. His voice was calm and steady, the voice of a man who had long ago learned that volume was the enemy of truth. "I am not going to argue about trade routes or military staging or economic reform. Instead, I am going to tell you a story. It is a true story. It happened in this room over the past 9 days, and every one of you was part of it." He opened his notebook. "The Veilith Concordance has presented the corridor redistribution as an economic reform designed to benefit all species equally. This is not true. The redistribution would reclassify 7 trade routes in the southern corridor as restricted military lanes. These routes are the primary livelihood of the Ulari trade guilds. The reclassification would destroy their economy within a single generation." He looked at the Ulari delegation. Taluves had gone very still inside their sphere. "The Veilith know this. It is not an accident, it is the purpose." The chamber shifted. Delegates exchanged glances. Salith Ka's wings folded slowly against her back, a movement so controlled it looked mechanical. Elias continued, "But the Ulari are not the target. They are the tool. The true purpose of the southern reclassification is to close the migration routes used by the Fenkai fleet peoples. The Fenkai have no homeworld. They depend on open hyperlanes the way a land species depends on air. By closing these lanes, the Veilith Concordance intends to force the Fenkai into a position where they must accept indentured labor contracts simply to survive. I have seen the draft contracts. They were written 4 years before this proposal was made public." A sound moved through the hall, not a gasp, not a shout, but a low vibration of shock that passed through dozens of species in dozens of ways. The Fenkai delegation sat rigid, their ambassador Kessorin staring at Elias with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and terror. Elias turned the page. Now, the Drenari hegemony. They have publicly supported the Veilith proposal and presented themselves as allies of the Concordance. This is also not true. The Drenari have a private agreement with the Valith, a mutual defense pact that would take effect once the redistribution passes. But within that agreement, buried in operational clauses that the Valith have not read carefully enough, is a provision that gives the Drenari exclusive military access to 3 junction points along the northern corridor. He looked at the Drenari delegation. Vorethkan sat like a statue carved from green stone. His claws, usually retracted in polite company, had extended half a centimeter, an involuntary response that only Elias seemed to notice. These junction points are not trade hubs, they are staging areas. The Drenari intend to use the redistribution as cover to position military assets along the Valith border. Within 5 years of the agreement passing, the hegemony would have the ability to blockade Valith space entirely. He paused. The Drenari are not the Valith's allies. They are preparing to become their conquerors. The low vibration in the hall became something louder. Salith Ka turned sharply toward the Drenari delegation. Vorethkan did not move, but his scales had darkened, a reptilian stress response visible even from across the chamber. Elias kept going. His voice did not change. It did not rise or fall. It simply moved forward, steady as water wearing away stone. The Ulari trade guilds were approached by the Drenari 6 cycles ago and offered protection in exchange for intelligence on Valith fleet movements along the corridor. The Ulari agreed because they had no other option. They have been functioning as unwitting espionage assets in a Cold War they did not know was being fought. Taluves turned a shade of gray so pale they were nearly invisible inside their sphere. And the Teshari. Elias looked at the small, feathered delegate in his oversized chair. Pikren sat absolutely still, his dark eyes fixed on Elias. The Teshari were uplifted to spacefaring status by the Drenari 90 years ago. Since that time, every vote the Teshari have cast in this assembly has been written by Drenari political staff. The Teshari have never once spoken their own words in this chamber. Their debt to the hegemony was structured to be unpayable, not by accident, but by design. They are not an independent delegation. They are a purchased vote wearing the mask of sovereignty. Pikren's feathered crest rose slowly. It was not a fear response. It was something else entirely, the physical expression of a creature hearing, for the first time, a truth it had carried in silence for its entire life spoken aloud by someone who was not afraid. The chamber erupted. Not into violence. The assembly had safeguards against that, but into a chaos of competing voices, flashing bioluminescence, vibrating thoraxes, and rapid-fire encrypted transmissions. Delegates shouted across the tiers. Aides rushed between seats. The great hall, which had operated on careful deception for 11,000 years, cracked like glass struck at exactly the right angle. Salith Ka raised her wings for silence. It took longer than it had ever taken before. When the room finally quieted, her voice was no longer silk. It was cold metal. The human delegation has violated the fundamental principles of assembly diplomacy, she said. What he has done is not transparency. It is an act of aggression. He has exposed private negotiations, revealed classified intelligence, and destabilized relationships that have maintained galactic peace for millennia. She turned to face the full assembly. I call for an immediate vote on the expulsion of the human species from this body. The vote was held within the hour. One by one, delegations cast their decisions. The major powers, the Valith, the Drenari, and their close allies voted for expulsion. The moderate delegations hesitated, some voting for, some abstaining. And then the minor delegations voted. The Ulari voted against expulsion. The Fengkai voted against expulsion. The Teshari, for the first time in 90 years, cast a vote that had not been written by someone else. Pikren stood on his oversized chair, his feathered crest fully raised, and said in a small but clear voice, the Teshari vote to retain the human delegation. One by one, the minor species fell in line. species that had never voted against the ruling coalition, species that had been silent for centuries, species that had come to believe their own voices did not matter. They voted, and they voted together, and when the final count was read, the motion to expel humanity had failed. Elias walked back to his small seat at the edge of the lowest tier and sat down. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line. The truth does not need to be loud, it just needs to be said. Behind him, Priya exhaled slowly. You know they are going to come for you now, she said quietly. Both of them, the Valith and the Drenari. Elias closed his notebook. I know. And you are not worried. He looked at the dying star through the chamber's great viewport, that dim orange light that had been fading for 1,000,000 years and still had not gone out. They have spent 11,000 years learning to deceive each other, he said. We spent 100,000 years learning to see through it. They are very good at their game. He paused. But it is our game too, and we have been playing it longer. The assassination attempt came 3 days after the failed expulsion vote. It was elegant, as galactic assassination attempts tended to be. No crude weapons, no hired killers. Instead, someone introduced a bioengineered protein chain into the atmospheric recycling system of the human delegation's residential section. The protein was harmless to every known species on the station, every species except humans. In humans, it would bind to hemoglobin and slowly replace oxygen in the bloodstream. Death would come in sleep, quiet and painless, looking like nothing more than a system's malfunction, a tragic accident, a lesson to the next species that thought about speaking out of turn. It was Priya who caught it. She noticed it not through any scanner or diagnostic tool. The human delegation did not have equipment sophisticated enough to detect Valith-grade bioweapons. She noticed it because of the maintenance crew. 3 Valith technicians had been assigned to service the atmospheric system in the human quarter that morning. Priya passed them in the corridor and saw something that made her stop. One of the technicians, a young male with pale, greenish wings, had glanced at her as she walked by. It was a fast glance, barely a flicker. But in that flicker, Priya saw something she had seen 1,000 times before in her career. She saw guilt. Not fear, not hostility. Guilt. The specific, unmistakable guilt of a person who knows they are part of something terrible and cannot stop it. Priya sealed the human quarter's ventilation within 4 minutes. She pulled the atmospheric filters and sent them to Dr. Okoro, who ran them through the delegation's basic chemical analysis kit. The protein chain showed up as an anomaly, unknown, synthetic, and concentrated at levels that would have reached lethal saturation by midnight. Elias was informed within the hour. He sat in his quarters, looking at the analysis report on a simple screen, and said nothing for a long time. Can we trace it? He asked. Not with our equipment, Priya said, but the technician I saw, I can describe him, and I can tell you he did not want to do it. Elias looked at her. How do you know? The same way you know when a delegate is lying. I saw his face. I saw the way his wings pulled tight against his body. I saw the way he looked at me not as a target but as a person he was about to hurt. She paused. He was ashamed. Elias nodded slowly. We are not going to report this to the assembly. Priya stared at him. They tried to kill us. And if we accuse them, they will deny it. The evidence will be insufficient by galactic standards, and we will look like paranoid newcomers crying for attention. That is what they want. He leaned back in his chair. We survive. We say nothing. And we let them wonder how we survived. That silence will frighten them more than any accusation. The second attack was not physical. It was something far older and far more dangerous. 4 days after the failed assassination, Salith Ka requested a special assembly session. She announced that the Valith Concordance wished to present a new version of the corridor proposal, one that addressed the concerns raised by the human delegate. She said this with warmth and openness. She said it with humility. She said the Valith had listened and learned. Elias knew immediately that something was wrong, not because of what she said but because of how it made him feel. When Salithka spoke, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a quiet, calm certainty that she was telling the truth. It felt natural. It felt like his own thought. And that was exactly what made it terrifying. The shaping. He had read about it in the intelligence files that Earth's first contact team had compiled. The Valith had developed it over thousands of years, a form of communication that went beyond language. It was not telepathy. It was not mind control. It was something more subtle and more dangerous. It was the art of structuring words, pauses, vocal frequencies, and physical gestures in patterns that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the emotional architecture of the listener's brain. It made agreement feel like your own idea. It made compliance feel like wisdom. It made surrender feel like victory. Every species in the galaxy had fallen to the shaping at some point in history. It was the Valith's greatest weapon, more powerful than any fleet, more devastating than any bomb. You could not fight it because you did not know it was happening. By the time you realized you had been shaped, you had already agreed. Salithka presented the new proposal. She spoke for 40 minutes. Her voice rose and fell like music. Her wings moved in slow, hypnotic patterns. Her compound eyes caught the light in ways that drew attention and held it. Every word she said made perfect sense. Every concession she offered seemed generous. Every clause in the new agreement seemed fair and balanced and wise. Elias sat in his seat and felt the pull of it. He felt his own resistance softening, felt his objections fading like dreams after waking. A voice in his mind, one that sounded exactly like his own, whispered that perhaps he had been too harsh. Perhaps the Valith were reasonable after all. Perhaps this new proposal really was fair. Perhaps he should simply agree. He gripped the edge of his seat. His knuckles turned white. Sweat formed on his forehead, a human stress response that no other species in the room understood. He could feel the shaping working on him the way a swimmer feels a current pulling them away from shore. It was gentle. It was patient. It was relentless. But Elias had spent his life in rooms with people who were very, very good at making you believe them. Warlords who wept for their victims. Politicians who spoke of justice while signing death warrants. Mothers who smiled while hiding bruises. He had learned, through decades of painful practice, to separate what he felt from what was true. He had learned to hold his own mind in his hands and examine it like an object, to ask himself the one question that every good investigator learns to ask: is this feeling mine, or was it put there by someone else? He held on. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than any interrogation, harder than any trial. The shaping was beautiful and perfect and almost irresistible, but almost was not enough. When Salithka finished, the chamber was silent, the kind of silence that follows a symphony. Delegates sat in their seats with glazed, peaceful expressions. They had been shaped. They were ready to agree. The vote would pass unanimously. Elias stood. His legs were unsteady. His shirt was damp with sweat. He walked to the central platform on feet that felt like they were made of stone, and he looked out at the assembly, 312 delegations sitting in the warm fog of the shaping, their objections dissolved, their fears soothed, their critical thoughts wrapped in cotton. He did not argue against the proposal. He did not attack the Valith. He did not present evidence or make accusations. Instead, he described what had just happened to him. "A moment ago," he said, Speaker Salithka spoke to this assembly, and as she spoke I felt something. I felt a warmth in my chest. I felt a certainty that she was right. I felt my own objections fade away, and in their place I felt agreement. It did not feel forced. It felt natural. It felt like my own thought. He paused. But it was not my thought. The fog in the chamber shifted. Delegates blinked. Antennae twitched. Tentacles uncurled. What I just experienced is called the shaping. It is a technique the Valith have used for thousands of years. It does not change your mind by force. It changes your mind by making you forget that your mind was changed. It speaks to the part of you that wants to agree, and it makes that part louder than the part of you that knows something is wrong. He looked directly at the delegations in the middle tiers, the moderate species, the fence-sitters, the ones who had felt the pull most strongly. Think about what you were feeling a moment ago. Think about that warmth, that certainty. Now ask yourself, did you feel that way before she spoke? Did you arrive at that agreement through your own reasoning? Or did it simply appear inside you, fully formed like a gift you did not ask for? The silence changed. It was no longer the peaceful silence that follows music. It was the sharp, cold silence of people realizing they have been asleep. One by one, delegates looked down at their own hands. They looked at each other. They looked at the Valith speaker standing at the edge of the platform, and for the first time they saw not an ally, not a partner, not a wise elder, but a woman who had just tried to reach inside their minds and rearrange the furniture. The vote was postponed. Salith Ka stood alone on the platform as delegates filed out of the chamber in disturbed silence. She watched them go. Then she turned to Elias, who was still standing at the central podium, exhausted, his suit wrinkled, his hands trembling slightly from the effort of resisting something that had conquered every other species in the galaxy. She looked at him for a long time. Her compound eyes reflected his face back at him in 1,000 tiny fragments. Then she bowed. It was not deep. It was not submissive. It was the bow of a master encountering something she had never encountered before, a species that could stand inside the shaping and walk out the other side. A species that could feel the lie, name the lie, and still remain standing. Elias bowed back, not because protocol demanded it, but because he understood what it had cost her to make that gesture, a Valith speaker, bowing before a species that had been in the galaxy for barely a heartbeat. He walked back to his seat on shaking legs. Priya was waiting. "That was close," she said. Elias sat down heavily. He closed his eyes. "Closer than anyone will ever know." "Can they do it again?" He opened his eyes and looked at the dying star beyond the viewport. "They can try, but it only works perfectly when the target does not know it is happening. Now everyone in this room knows." He paused. "You cannot unsee a lie once someone has pointed at it. That is the one thing every liar fears, not a stronger liar, but someone who simply says out loud what is actually happening." The assembly was broken. Not destroyed, nothing had been bombed or burned or dissolved, but the invisible machinery that had kept it running for 11,000 years had seized up, and no one knew how to restart it. The gears of that machinery had always been greased with deception, careful, mutual, agreed-upon deception. Every species knew that every other species was lying. That was the foundation. You lied to me, I lied to you, and as long as we both pretended not to notice, the system worked. Elias had removed the pretending, and without it, the whole structure fell apart. In the 2 weeks following his exposure of the shaping, no major legislation was passed. No trade agreements were signed. No disputes were arbitrated. Delegations retreated into their own quarters and refused to meet with anyone. Encrypted communication channels, which had always hummed with backroom deals and secret negotiations, went silent. The Valith and the Drenari, their hidden agendas now visible to everyone, could not form coalitions because no one trusted the terms they offered. The moderate species, shaken by the realization that they had been shaped and manipulated for centuries, refused to commit to anything. The minor species, emboldened but inexperienced, argued among themselves about what to do with their sudden freedom. The galaxy's most important governing body had become a room full of people staring at each other in suspicious silence. Elias watched this happen from his small seat. He came to every session. He sat quietly. He took notes, and he said nothing because he understood that what was happening needed to happen. A wound had to be opened before it could be cleaned. On the 17th day of paralysis, Kessorin came to see him. She found him in his quarters, sitting at his desk with his notebook open. The pages were filled with diagrams, not of political alliances or military positions, but of something else. Lines connecting species names to single words: Ulari, survival; Fenkai, freedom; Teshari, dignity; Drenari, security; Valith, control, and beside each word a question mark. "The assembly is dying," Kessorin said without greeting. "You broke it. What are you going to do about it?" Elias looked at her. "What do you want me to do?" "Fix it." "I did not break it. It was already broken. The cracks were just hidden." "That is a fine philosophy," Kessorin said, and her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had spent her entire life being practical because her people could not afford to be anything else. "But philosophy does not reopen travel lanes. Philosophy does not feed my fleet's children. The assembly may have been built on lies, but it was the only thing keeping the galaxy from war. If it collapses, the Valith and the Drenari will settle their differences with fleets instead of words, and every small species in their path will be crushed." Elias was quiet for a long time. He looked down at his diagrams, at the single words he had written beside each species name, at the question marks. "You are right," he said. The next morning, Elias requested a special session. When the assembly gathered, reluctantly, suspiciously, with the weary tension of people who had been sitting in a dark room too long, he walked to the central platform for the third time. He looked different. Not physically, he wore the same plain suit, carried the same notebook, but something in his posture had changed. The first time he had stood here, he had been an observer. The second time, he had been a surgeon cutting into diseased tissue. This time, he stood like a man offering his hand to someone who was drowning. "I owe this assembly an honesty," he said. "When I exposed the deception in this room, I told myself I was doing the right thing, and perhaps I was, but I did not think carefully enough about what would come after. I tore down a system that was built on lies, and I did not offer anything to replace it. That was my failure, and I accept it." The chamber was very quiet. Delegates who had expected another attack leaned forward slightly, caught off guard by the admission. "But I am standing here today because I believe there is something that can replace it. It is not a new system. It is not a new set of rules. It is something much simpler and much harder." He paused. "I am asking every delegation in this room to say what they actually want." The silence that followed was deeper than any silence that had come before. It was the silence of 312 species hearing something so foreign, so fundamentally alien to their understanding of diplomacy, that their minds needed a moment to process that they had heard it correctly. "Not what you think you can get," Elias continued. "Not what your intelligence services tell you is strategically optimal, not the position that gives you the best leverage. I am asking each of you to stand at this platform and say, plainly and honestly, what your species needs, what you are afraid of, what you hope for. No subclauses, no hidden provisions, no performance." Vorath Khan was the first to respond. "This is absurd," the Drenari representative said. "You are asking us to strip ourselves bare before our enemies." "I'm asking you to stop treating everyone in this room as an enemy," Elias said. "You have spent so long deceiving each other that you have forgotten something important. Deception is expensive. It takes enormous resources to maintain lies. It takes intelligence networks and counterintelligence networks and alliances built on threats and debts that never get repaid. Every species in this room is exhausted by it. I can see it in your faces. I can see it in the way you hold yourselves. You are all so tired of lying, and you are all so afraid to stop." The chamber stirred, not with anger, with recognition. The uncomfortable, unwanted recognition of a truth that had been lived but never spoken. Salith Ka rose from her seat. Every eye turned to her. She was the most powerful figure in the room, the leader of the oldest coalition, the master of the shaping. If she rejected this, it would die before it began. She stood in silence for a long time. Her wings shifted through colors that no translator could interpret, not because they were encoded. but because they were emotions too complex for words. Finally, she spoke. The Valeth Concordance needs a security buffer along our spinward border. We have needed it for 600 years. We have never asked for it directly because to do so would be to admit vulnerability, and in this room, vulnerability has always been death. Her voice was different, stripped of its silk, stripped of its shaping. It was just a voice, tired, honest, and afraid. The chamber held its breath. Vorethkan stood next. His scales had not darkened. His claws were retracted. He looked like a soldier who had just set down a weapon he had been carrying for so long that his arms ached. The Drenari hegemony is afraid, he said. The word landed like a stone, a Drenari admitting fear. We are a military species, it is all we have ever been, and we are afraid that if we do not expand, we will be consumed. Every action we have taken, every alliance, every betrayal has been driven by that fear. He paused, and something shifted in his face that Elias recognized instantly. It was relief. The relief of a man who has finally said the thing he has been carrying in silence for decades. One by one, they came forward. The Ulari spoke of their fragile economy and the terror of extinction that haunted every generation. The Fenkai spoke of their children and the open sky between stars that was the only home they had ever known. The Teshari, Pikrin, small and feathered, standing on the platform that dwarfed him, spoke in his own words for the first time. He talked about what it felt like to be uplifted and then leashed. He talked about the shame of reading someone else's words in a room full of beings who never noticed. He talked about the dream of speaking freely. His voice cracked twice, and he did not try to hide it. The session lasted 14 hours. It was messy. It was uncomfortable. Species that had never spoken honestly to each other argued and interrupted and sometimes shouted. Old wounds were opened. Ancient grievances were aired. Twice, Elias had to step in and mediate, not by exposing lies, but by simply pointing out when two species were saying the same thing in different words and could not hear each other through their own fear. But it worked. The new corridor agreement was not elegant. It was not a masterpiece of diplomatic language. It was a plain, simple document that said plainly and simply what each species would get, what each species would give, and why. The Fenkai got their migration routes, not because someone was forced to concede them, but because the assembly heard, for the first time, what it meant for a people to have no home except the road. The Ulari retained their trade access with new protections written in language they had helped choose. The Valeth received their security buffer, openly, without shame, as an acknowledged need rather than a stolen advantage. The Drenari received a mutual defense consultation, something they could never have obtained through deception, because no one would have trusted the offer. The Teshari debt was restructured. It would take 3 generations to repay, but the terms were honest, and for the first time the Teshari could see the end of it. The vote passed. Not unanimously, there were holdouts, skeptics, species who distrusted the new approach and perhaps always would. But it passed with a margin that would have been unthinkable a month ago, carried by a coalition that had not existed before a single human sat in a small chair and watched. After the vote, as the chamber slowly emptied, Salithka walked across the floor to where Elias stood by the viewport. The dying star hung in the darkness beyond the glass, its dim orange light painting their faces in warm color. She stood beside him for a while without speaking. Then she asked the question that had been forming behind her compound eyes since the day he had walked into the assembly. "How do you live like this?" she said, "knowing every lie, hearing every false word, seeing every hidden thing. How do you bear it?" Elias looked at the star. He thought about Earth. He thought about every interrogation room he had ever sat in, every face he had ever read, every lie he had ever caught, and every truth he had ever found hiding underneath. "We do not just hear the lies, speaker," he said quietly. "We hear what people are afraid to say, and most of the time what they are afraid to say is the truth." Salith Ka considered this. Her wings shifted to a color Elias had never seen, something soft and deep, like twilight on a world he would never visit. "Perhaps," she said, "that is the most human thing about you." 3 days later, the Assembly voted to grant Earth permanent membership. And with it, they created something new, a role that had never existed in the 11,000-year history of the galactic government. They called it Mediator of Record. It was not a position of power. It carried no military authority, no trade privileges, no territorial claims. It was simply this, a seat at every negotiation, held by the one species in the galaxy that could hear what was really being said. Elias accepted the role in a brief ceremony that he insisted be kept simple. He wore the same plain suit. He carried the same notebook. He stood at the central platform and said 5 words. "We will listen, we promise." He returned to his small seat. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. And as the assembly moved on to its next piece of business, still messy, still imperfect, still learning how to speak without masks, Elias Voss, the 53-year-old war crimes investigator from a small blue planet at the edge of the galaxy, began to write. The dying star beyond the viewport burned on, fading but not yet gone. And in its last light, something new was beginning.